12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Okay, we got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
The Apollo program, also known as Project Apollo, was conceived early in 1960 during the Eisenhower administration as a follow-up to America's Mercury program. It was later dedicated to President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon.
The program was named after the Greek god of light, music, and the sun by NASA manager Abe Silverstein.
In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president after a campaign that promised American superiority over the Soviet Union in the fields of space exploration and missile defense. Using aerospace technology as a symbol of national prestige, he warned of a missile gap between the two nations, pledging to make the U.S. not first, but first and, first if, but first, period.
On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to fly in space, reinforcing American fears about being left behind in a technological competition with the Soviet Union.
On May 25, 1961, 20 days after the first U.S. manned spaceflight, Freedom 7, Kennedy proposed the manned moon landing to Congress in a special address to a joint session.
National goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. In conclusion,
as Kennedy had to find a goal, the Apollo mission planners were faced with the challenge of designing a spacecraft that could meet it, while minimizing risk to human life, cost, and demands on technology and astronaut skill.
Soon after deciding to use the LOR Lunar Orbit Rendezvous method, designed by John Houbolt, engineers began to design and build spacecrafts.
The Command Module, or CM, was the conical crew cabin, designed to carry 3 astronauts from launch to lunar orbit and back to an Earth-ocean landing. It was the only component of the Apollo spacecraft to survive without major configuration changes as the program evolved from the early Apollo study designs.
The lunar module, LM, was designed to descend from the lunar orbit to land 2 astronauts on the moon and take them back to orbit to rendezvous with the command module. It was not designed to fly through Earth's atmosphere or return to Earth alone.
Saturn I, the first U.S. heavy-lift rocket, was initially planned to launch partially equipped CSMs, or Command Service Modules, in low Earth orbit tests. The S-1 had 4 stages that produced 1,500,000 pounds force of thrust.
The first 4 Saturn I test flights were launched with only live first stages, carrying dummy upper stages filled with water. The S-1, 22,500-pound payload capacity, would have severely limited the systems which could be included, so the decision was made in October 1963 to use the uprated Saturn 1B for all manned Earth orbital flights.
The Saturn 1B was an upgraded version of the Saturn I. The S-1B first stage increased the thrust to 1,600,000 pounds force, but could only launch a partially fueled CSM or LM.
The 3-stage Saturn V was designed to send a fully fueled command service module and lunar module to the moon.
Multiple unmanned missions were executed prior to Apollo 1 that validated the service module engine and the command module heat shield.
The Apollo astronauts were chosen by Donald K. Deke Slayton, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations during the Apollo program. He was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts who was medically grounded in September 1962 due to a heart murmur. All missions were commanded by Gemini or Mercury veterans.
The astronauts of Apollo 1, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, decided to name their flight Apollo 1 as a motivational focus on the first manned flight. They trained and conducted tests of their spacecraft at North American and in the altitude chamber at the Kennedy Space Center. A plugs out test was planned for January, which would simulate a launch countdown.
The out test began on the morning of January 27, 1967, and immediately was plagued with problems. First, the crew noticed a strange odor in their spacesuits, which delayed the sealing of the hatch. Then, communication problems frustrated the astronauts and forced a hold in the simulated countdown. During this hold, an electrical fire began in the cabin and spread quickly in the high-pressure, 100% oxygen atmosphere. Pressure rose high enough from the fire that the cabin burst and the fire erupted onto the pad area, making attempts to rescue the crew almost impossible. The astronauts were asphyxiated before the hatch could be opened.
To remedy the causes of the fire, Apollo 2 and 3 were canceled, and changes were made in the spacecraft and operational procedures, the most important of which were the use of a nitrogen and oxygen mixture instead of a pure oxygen before and during the launch, and the removal of flammable cabin and spacesuit materials.
Apollo 4 was the first unmanned flight following the Apollo 1 fire and launch on November 9, 1967. It was named Apollo 4 to make up for the two skipped missions, Apollo 2 and Apollo 3, and to retire the Apollo 1 name to honor the fallen astronauts. Apollo 5 and 6 took flight in early 1968. What do you remember about the Apollo missions?
Apollo missions during that time frame was really exciting. As a young kid, we were glued to the TV, watching the fuzzy images that came back. All of the newspapers. This was frontline news. It was anywhere from and it was kind of overshadowed because you had the Vietnam War going on at the same time. But I can remember just getting the newspaper and just reading every bit of it, just sucking it in like a sponge. But it also kind of got us really interested in science and space in general. So we were able...
Apollo 7, which launched on October 11, 1968, was crewed by Walter M. Schirra, Command Module Pilot Don F. Easel, and Lunar Module Pilot R. Walter Cunningham. It was an 11-day Earth orbital flight, which tested the CSM systems. It was the first launch of a Saturn 1B vehicle to put a crew into space, the first three-person American space mission, and the first live TV broadcast from an American spacecraft. The mission was a complete technical success, giving NASA the confidence to launch Apollo 8 around the moon 2 months later.
Apollo 8, the second human spaceflight mission in the United States Apollo space program, was launched on December 21, 1968, and became the first manned spacecraft to leave Earth orbit, reach the Earth's moon, orbit, and return safely to Earth. The three astronaut crew, Commander Frank Borman, Commander Module Pilot James Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot William Anders, became the first humans to travel beyond low Earth orbit, the first to see Earth as a whole planet, and the first to directly see the far side of the moon.
Apollo 8 took 3 days to travel to the moon. It orbited 10 times over the course of 20 hours, during which the crew made a Christmas Eve television broadcast where they read the first 10 verses from the book of Genesis. At the time, the broadcast was the most watched TV program ever.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Apollo 9 was the third manned mission in United States Apollo space program and the first flight of the Command Service Module with the Lunar Module. Its three-person crew, consisting of Commander James McDivitt, Command Module pilot David Scott, and Lunar Module pilot Rusty Schweickart, tested several aspects crucial to landing on the Moon. This flight and Apollo 10, which was also known as the dress rehearsal, were crucial to the success of Apollo 11.
Apollo 11 was the space flight that landed the first humans, Americans Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the Moon on July 20th, 1969, at 8:18 p.m. Armstrong became the first to step onto the lunar surface 6 hours later on July 21st at 2:56 a.m. Armstrong spent about 2.5 hours outside the spacecraft, Aldrin slightly less, and together they collected 47.5 pounds of lunar material for return to Earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
On the Apollo 12 mission, the astronauts collected pieces from the Surveyor, an unmanned lunar probe, and brought them back to Earth.
Apollo 13 was the seventh manned mission in the American Apollo space program, and the third intended to land on the Moon. The craft was launched on April 11, 1970, at 1:13 p.m. from the Kennedy Space Center, Florida, but the lunar landing was aborted after an oxygen tank exploded 2 days later, crippling the service module upon which the command module depended.
What it meant.
We had an explosion with an enormous amount of corollary damage.
In fact, they came to learn Apollo 13 had suffered a catastrophic failure. There was faulty wiring inside liquid oxygen tank 2. When Jack Swigert stirred the tank, a spark started a fire, fueled by pure oxygen. The tank blew up, taking out the ship's main supplies of air and power.
I realized the gas escaping and the needle on my second and last tank, the quantity gauge, was one of the same, and shortly we'd be completely out of oxygen.
Completely out of oxygen, speeding away from Earth at 2,000 miles per hour.
I think every controller at that time recognized we're not going to the Moon, but also it's going to be tough, damn tough.
Despite great hardship caused by limited power, loss of cabin heat, shortage of potable water, and the critical need to jerry-rig the carbon dioxide removal system, the crew returned safely to Earth on April 17th.
13's mission was reassigned to Apollo 14, commanded in February 1971 by Mercury veteran Alan Shepard with Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell. This time the mission was successful.
Apollo 15 and 16 were routine collection missions, and both crews spent about 3 days on the Moon's surface.
Apollo 17 was the first night launch of a U.S. human spaceflight and the final crewed launch of a Saturn V rocket. It was a mission which included a 3-day lunar surface stay, extended scientific capability, and the third lunar roving vehicle. Apollo 17 also broke several records set by previous flights, including the longest manned lunar landing flight, the longest total lunar surface extravehicular activities, the largest lunar sample return, and the longest time in lunar orbit. Apollo 17 remains the most recent manned moon landing and also the last time humans have traveled beyond low Earth orbit.
NASA's yearly budget began to shrink in light of the successful Apollo 11 landing, and NASA also had to make funds available for the development of the upcoming space shuttle. By 1971, the decision was made to cancel missions 18, 19, and 20.
An effect of the Apollo program is the view of Earth as a fragile, small planet, captured in photographs taken by the astronauts during the lunar missions.
According to The Economist, Apollo succeeded in accomplishing President Kennedy's goal of taking on the Soviet Union in the space race, and beat it by accomplishing a singular and a significant achievement.